Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something that feels less like a simple theory and a whole lot more like a premium psychology documentary playing out right in our very own lives. We are looking deeply at Robert Greene's law of compulsive behavior. This law exposes the profound, often totally invisible forces that are actively dictating our lives right now. We're going to explore the hidden architecture of human character, exactly why we self-sabotage, and how our earliest, most unconscious wiring ultimately controls our adult destiny.
The ancient philosopher Heraclitus once made this incredibly profound observation. He said, "Character is destiny." And honestly, this one insight completely flips everything we think we know about fate. I mean, for thousands of years, humans believed in some mystical force, spirits or gods that predetermined our lives. Even today, we tend to blame bad luck or a cursed universe when things go entirely wrong. But the reality, what we call fate, is actually just our own ingrained character manifesting over and over again, almost entirely outside of our conscious awareness. I want you to just sit and think about this question for a moment. Why do we continually fall for exactly the wrong person? Why do we unconsciously push away the right ones when things are actually going well? Or, why do we watch a friend make a completely disastrous career move, only to see them repeat that exact same foolishness just a few years later? It's deeply, deeply disturbing to realize that we might be operating under some kind of invisible psychological compulsion. But to really understand how this works, we need to look at a truly epic historical failure.
Section 1. The Tragedy of Howard Hughes. So at just 19 years old, Howard Hughes inherited a massively profitable family tool company. He literally had all the money and independence in the world. He moved to Hollywood and decided, I'm going to make an epic World War I aviation film called Hell's Angels. But there was a catch. He couldn't just let his directors work. He endlessly interfered, he fussed over every single shot, and eventually he took over directing it himself, bleeding millions of dollars in the process. And this compulsive need for absolute control, it only escalated. During World War II, he secured massive military contracts, including the infamous Spruce Goose aircraft, but his constant micromanagement and total inability to trust professionals led to exactly 0 usable planes being delivered for the war effort. By the end of his life in 1976, this former billionaire playboy weighed a mere 93 pounds, living in total germ-phobic isolation, completely dependent on a few assistants just to survive. Now, what's truly fascinating here is the massive, tragic gap between perception and reality. Hughes sold the world a glittering myth. The public saw this dashing young maverick, right? A rugged individualist who bravely flew planes and dated movie stars. But the reality behind closed doors was a deeply anxious micromanager. His total inability to delegate or trust anyone systematically destroyed almost every business he actually touched, from aircraft manufacturing to the RKO film studio. His fortune was really only saved by that original tool company, which, ironically enough, was run completely independently of him. So, how does someone's inner world become this disconnected and this destructive? Let's move on to the 4 layers of character. This is where the behavioral psychology truly gets fascinating. Character isn't just a vibe. It is something deeply engraved, literally stamped into our neurology. And it's built in 4 distinct layers. The earliest and deepest layer is our genetics, how our brains are wired right from birth, predisposing us to certain baseline moods, like introversion, extroversion, or greed. The second layer, which forms in our first 3 or 4 years of life, comes directly from our early attachments to our caregivers. This literally maps our emotional neural pathways. The third layer forms from our habits as we get older, locking those early coping strategies firmly into our nervous system. And finally, the fourth layer, developed in adolescence, is the front. Let's drill down into that crucial second layer, early attachment. Psychoanalyst John Bowlby studied how maternal attachment permanently stamps our character. One specific type is the enmeshed ambivalent attachment. And Hughes, he is the textbook case here. You see, his mother nearly died giving birth to him. Unable to have more children, she directed this massive, suffocating anxiety toward her only son. She absolutely smothered him with attention, practically never letting him out of his sight. This wired Hughes's young, developing brain to feel a profound, inescapable sense of helplessness and dependency. As an adult, his extreme micromanagement wasn't just a quirky business strategy. It was a desperate, unconscious psychological defense mechanism against the terrifying helplessness he felt as a little boy. And that brings us perfectly to the fourth layer, the front. As we become teenagers, we suddenly become hyper-aware of our character flaws. If someone is deeply anxious or timid, they quickly realize, hey, this isn't socially acceptable. So what do? They construct a psychological disguise.
They compensate by acting incredibly outgoing, domineering, or hyper-confident. This acts like a giant optical illusion, making it incredibly difficult to determine someone's true nature. Because, let's face it, we are naturally mesmerized by people's carefully curated appearances and their glittering resumes. How to spot weak character. So, how exactly do we pierce through this disguise? You have to actively train yourself to ignore the front and look for the everyday tells. For instance, are they consistently late in finishing simple, seemingly unimportant assignments? Because listen, if they are forgetful or sloppy on small matters, they will be absolutely disastrous on important ones. Look closely at how they treat their employees or the waitstaff when they think no one important is watching. Or observe them in an off-hours game or sport. A hyper-competitive need to bend or circumvent the rules in a friendly game on a Saturday often reveals deep layers of insecurity that they so carefully hide back at the office on Monday. But the absolutely crucial point is this. Under stress, the front always crumbles. In everyday, easy life, people are quite adept at disguising their flaws. But throw them into a sudden crisis or a high-pressure situation, and people lose their normal self-control. It's like a pressure cooker. Their carefully constructed masks slip, revealing their profound fear of failure, their hidden insecurities, and their ultimate lack of inner resilience. Suddenly, that charming, easygoing colleague becomes vicious and evasive. Under extreme stress, the truth always leaks out. Abraham Lincoln perfectly encapsulated another incredibly vital test when he said, "If you want to test a man's character, give him power." Just like intense, sudden stress, the acquisition of power completely strips away societal restraints. When someone finally reaches the top, they no longer need to play the perfect, polite courtier. Power doesn't necessarily change people. Actually, it simply reveals more of who they always were right beneath the surface. The toxic types to avoid. Now that we know exactly how the mask slips, we need to recognize what's hiding underneath. First up is the hyper-perfectionist. At first glance, you're totally lured in by their incredible dedication and the crazy long hours they work. But if you ever work for them, you will quickly discover a living nightmare. Much like Howard Hughes, they have incredibly deep dependency issues. They literally cannot delegate because they are terrified to their core of losing control. And make no mistake, this isn't about maintaining high standards. It is entirely about power. They will create constant chaos, pit employees against each other, and slowly chew you up with their abusiveness and their endless, exhausting mistrust. Next is the drama magnet. They draw you in with their exciting, highly animated presence. But pretty soon, you notice they are perpetually embroiled in bickering and bizarre conflicts. And somehow, they are always playing the wronged victim. Why? Because in their childhood, the only way they got love and attention was to enmesh their parents in their troubles. Manufacturing drama became their fundamental psychological survival mechanism, just to feel alive and wanted. If you don't recognize this pattern early, they will absolutely drag you into their chaos and make you feel incredibly guilty for simply trying to disengage. Then we have the pampered prince or princess. They exude this calm, almost regal air of superiority that can actually be quite alluring. But slowly, inevitably, you'll find yourself doing all sorts of favors for them, taking on their responsibilities. In their childhood, they were shielded from the harsh outside world and had their every single whim indulged. As adults, their greatest unconscious desire is to replicate this lost paradise. They subtly manipulate you into pampering them, often throwing these quiet, baby-like tantrums if they don't get exactly what they want. Finally, the pleaser. You have probably never met anyone so charming and so seemingly considerate, but soon they just happen to not show up as promised, or they make these subtle, little mistakes that totally sabotage your work. These people are consummate courtiers. Their niceness isn't genuine affection at all. It's a hardened defense mechanism, likely developed early on to deflect hostility from harsh or unpredictable parents. Behind the smiles and the constant flattery lies a very deep well of resentment. They will eagerly defer to your face, but passively aggressively strike you the absolute second your guard is down. Taking control of your destiny. So, how do we protect ourselves and, more importantly, break free from our own toxic cycles? You must always keep in mind the primary corollary of this law. People never do something just once. Never. They might excuse themselves claiming they just lost their head in the heat of the moment or they were just super stressed, but they will inevitably repeat the exact same behavior. It is an unconscious compulsion deeply engraved right into their neurology. Therefore, when you are judging someone's character, you have to ignore the glittering words and the apologies and focus entirely on the repeating patterns of their past actions. But what about your own character? Listen, it is essentially impossible to completely get rid of the stamp that constitutes your foundational character.
It is simply wired too deep. However, through intense, unsparing self-awareness, you absolutely can learn to catch these compulsions in real time. By bravely examining your own past and identifying the recurring negative patterns in your life, you can consciously build new habits to override them. You can literally transform weak, reactive aspects of yourself into actual, resilient strengths through active daily practice. Which leaves us with this final, powerful thought. Look at your own history. I don't mean the story you tell others at dinner parties, but the hard, undeniable reality of your actions. What is the one self-sabotaging, compulsive pattern that keeps showing up over and over again in your relationships or your career? Because until you step up and make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to dictate your life, and you will just continue to call it fate. Thank you for joining this explainer. We'll see you next time.